In Chapter 17, we'll be talking about disease and resistance in general to prepare us for our disease projects and to be able to look at specific diseases with a little more detail in the future. So when it comes to a host and a microbe, like a bacteria for instance, there's a relationship there. And so microbes don't always have hosts, but if they do, then they are possibly able to cause infection. Infection means that they've gained entry into a host, they've established a population, and they're able to multiply and keep that population going within the host. The host is whoever the organism is entering, and then we call it actually disease when there's damage that occurs to the body because of the infection. So a person could have an infection without having a disease. One of the most obvious examples is HIV. Someone can be infected with HIV for a long period of time without actually showing the disease of AIDS, but there are a lot of other infections that kind of follow the same route. And so when it comes to the human body, the estimate is that there are about 10 trillion cells, and so it's a little hard to kind of wrap your brain around that one, but the point on the other bullet here is that there are estimated to be over 100 trillion microbes. And so basically for every cell that you have in your body, you probably have 10 times as many microbes. So this is what we call the human microbiota, or sometimes our normal flora. And so most microbes that are on our body are not pathogenic, meaning they don't cause disease. And they actually protect us against disease because they want to remain living where they're living. And so if anything comes along that threatens that existence, they'll try to fight it off. So while it may seem kind of gross to think that, we're covered with bacteria, again, most of those are going to be helpful to us as well. And so we can look again at symbiotic relationships. We've talked before about mutualism, commensalism, and then parasitism. So parasitism is kind of the topic of this chapter, but keeping in mind that most of these organisms actually do benefit us or really do not harm us. So in the case of mutualism, we as humans may get a benefit from the bacteria listed here, lactobacilli in the vagina, E. coli in the gut. These take up residence on our bodies and they are going to ward off other pathogens that maybe will come into play. And then sometimes they actually produce things for us, like E. coli produces vitamin K in our large intestine. Commensalism just means that they may be there, they're taking housing on us, but we are not really getting much of a benefit. There's a type of Corynebacteria that lives on the skin and just kind of thrives on eating dead skin cells, but we don't really get a benefit, but again, we're not really bothered by it. So that's an example of commensalism. So when somebody does take antibiotics, we talked in another chapter about antibiotic resistance, besides wiping out the bad bacteria, if it's even there, if we really need the antibiotic, we're also a lot of times wiping out the good. And so, we can get that back, but we don't want to take those antibiotics if we don't need to. And so this is a good figure just to kind of show some examples of some of the different types of organisms that are growing all over our body. A lot of them you'll notice here are bacteria, but there's also a lot that fall in the fungal category, like Candida. And while, somebody getting a yeast infection is not a great thing, very uncomfortable feeling, it's important that they're there. It's just when the bacteria that are around them kind of disappear that maybe the yeast grows in greater supply, and so therefore it causes some issues. But they are meant to be there in small amounts. And so as far as how we accumulate this microbiota, from the moment that a newborn is born, if a baby is born through the vaginal canal, then they are exposed to the bacteria in the mother's vaginal canal. And so babies that are delivered via C-section don't get this exposure, not that they can't acquire their own besides from this initial exposure, but studies have recently been done that show that maybe those babies who are delivered by C-section tend to be more likely to possibly be obese or tend to be more likely to have asthma. Not that everyone, develops these conditions just because of a C-section, but the tendency is there, and so it probably is better if somebody can deliver vaginally that they do so. But the point is that over time, pretty quickly, I think about by the age of 3, these infants start to acquire these microbes, and so they start to acquire their immunity, and there's a lot of different ways. So if a mother is nervous and wants to keep her baby shielded from every microbe out there and is, scrubbing down the house with bleach constantly, that baby may likely have more trouble in the future because they're not going to be exposed to small amounts of these microbes and get a little bit of resistance going. So when we look at infectious disease, there's kind of a lot of terms that you need to be aware of. The good news is that sometimes having to know terms makes things seem a little bit easier, but we also kind of want to understand what they mean and not just be able to rattle off a definition to those. But as I've kind of mentioned before, pathogenicity would be a microbe that is able to cause disease. Not all microbes are pathogenic, and sometimes they actually will maybe live on a person and not be pathogenic. Occasionally they can become pathogenic because they become opportunistic. They find an area of the body that they wouldn't normally be able to inhabit, but because this person has something, their immune system is down, they're able to actually get to areas where they should not be. But most of the time, like I said, a lot of them are not pathogenic. But if they are, we kind of have to talk about the degree of pathogenicity. So how virulent are they? And so you can look up statistics about different types of infections and what does it take in general for someone to become infected, to become sick with the disease. A lot of times we can look at what amount of a toxin would it take to make someone sick, or how many bacteria would it take. One bacteria may not cause a problem, but 250 bacteria or 1,000 bacteria or whatnot may. And so there's all these numbers that are actually out there, and you could look those things up. As far as classification of disease, epidemiologists are always studying different diseases, and there's a list of reportable diseases. In the United States, this means that if somebody comes into a doctor's office or a hospital or a healthcare setting, and they are diagnosed with a certain disease, a lot of times they have to be reported to the health department, who then reports them to the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. This is to make sure that somebody is keeping an eye on these different diseases and kind of looking and seeing if there's ever an epidemic or even a pandemic. And so an epidemic would mean that your numbers were increasing in a certain population. And you can look at this all kinds of ways. You could look at, people in Stevenson County. You could look at people in Illinois. You could look at people in the United States. Lots of different ways to report these numbers. But it's important to see if anything really kind of strays from the norm. If it does, then scientists can kind of look and see why maybe it's happening and what can we do about it if it's going to be something that might be really deadly or really dangerous. And so if you remember influenza 1918, that was considered to be a pandemic because you can see from this map here all of the places that it spread throughout the world. If there is a disease, a lot of times, it's always present in a population, but at really low levels. And so low levels is normal, unless the disease is completely eradicated and gone, it's always going to be somewhere. And so this is what we would call an endemic level. And so again, this would be a number where somebody could kind of monitor, okay, this is usually the rate of infection in this certain county, but for some reason we're seeing an increase, and so we want to keep an eye on it and make sure that it doesn't become an epidemic. And if it does, we want to figure out how to treat it, how to prevent it, and how to make sure that it does not get any worse than that. We can actually hopefully help those numbers to go down. And so we'll be looking at methods of contact here as far as how we transmit diseases. And so there's direct and there's indirect. Those in itself are pretty self-explanatory, but there's all kinds of different ways to think about each of these categories. And so when we look at the transmission of disease, some examples of direct contact would be touch. The touch could just be shaking hands, it could be kissing, it could be sexual intercourse. Also, there could be viruses or bacteria in a cough or a sneeze, and those droplets that come from a person physically touch another person and are transmitted. I've seen videos of how far can a sneeze actually travel, and I think they've gotten, up to a good 6 feet as far as how those droplets can actually land far away from the person who caused them to happen in the first place. So it's kind of interesting. Indirect contact, there's a lot more kind of ways to think about this one, but you can have things traveling through the air, through water, or through food. So these are all non-living sources. If you think about, cutting raw chicken on a cutting board, there's a lot of bacteria in the chicken, and so that's fine. In order to eat the chicken, it should be cooked because that kills everything off. But leaving the bacteria behind on a cutting board and then maybe cutting some vegetables on that same cutting board can be an issue. And so that would be an example of indirect contact. If we have something like maybe a cutting board or a drinking glass or a needle from a syringe, these are actually specifically called fomites. So these are non-living objects that can kind of house these microbes. And if they survive before they don't die before they're passed on, then they can be passed on from one host to another. Another interesting way to look at indirect contact is through arthropods. We studied this a little bit already when we talked about malaria and the transmission via mosquitoes. And so arthropods are those organisms that have a jointed exoskeleton. And so something like a crayfish would be an example, but also insects and spiders. Ticks fall into this category, lice, etc., things like that. And so there's a couple different ways that these organisms can pass on microbes, and one is just mechanically. So if you think about a housefly, you probably don't think about a housefly really as passing on disease a whole lot, but that fly could land on something, a substance that's not so great. Think about, some dog poop sitting out in the yard and you're at a picnic, and so it lands on that, and then the next thing that it lands on is your hot dog. And so it has passed on whatever it picked up from the feces in the yard to the food that you're eating. Then you eat it, and who knows what happens after that. Maybe nothing, but maybe then we have this transport going on. But that's mechanical because the fly didn't really bite you or anything. It just physically picked something up and then passed it on to you. A biological vector is like what we looked at in the case of malaria and the mosquitoes, as far as it picks up the pathogen. In that case, it picked up that protozoan, and the protozoan multiplied in the arthropod. Then the arthropod, the mosquito, went and bit another host, and it passed it on that way as well. And so a vector is just kind of anything that is used as a tool in order to pass things on, but certainly the multiplication inside the vector can be pretty damaging. A few more terms here, just that you kind of need to make sense of. A reservoir, sometimes we see that term, and that just means where is the microbe living. So a reservoir could be an animal. If it is an animal and this animal passes on disease to humans, we specifically call this disease a zoonosis. So a lot of animals, like an animal passing on rabies, maybe a raccoon passes on rabies. Rabies would be considered a zoonosis because it's carried in an animal. But a reservoir, as far as where they live, can be also non-living, like living in the water, living in the soil. It doesn't always have to be living in a cell or a host that is alive. And so another example here is a carrier. And so a carrier is something or someone who may be harboring an infection, but maybe they're not sick. And so then they may pass it on and pass it on to somebody who maybe would get sick from it. Their immune system's different, or they have different makeup, or they're immunocompromised, and so it could be dangerous as well. An example here, and this is in your discussion forum for someone to do more research on, but it's pretty interesting, is Typhoid Mary. And so she was a carrier of the bacteria that causes typhoid fever. And a lot went into the epidemiology and the study of her because it kind of seemed like wherever she went, people were dying. And so be sure to read more about her because, again, it's a pretty interesting story.